Hey friends, it's Gloria and welcome back to another video. This is going to be Bookmas Day 2. And I'm going to be talking about all of the reading that I got to do in the month of November. It was a fun month. I would dare say probably my favorite reading month of the year because Nonfiction November happened, hosted by the wonderful Book Olive, and I absolutely love reading nonfiction. And also I co-hosted Historathon this year, which is a historical fiction readathon that happened. And I pretty much exclusively read nonfiction and historical fiction, but let me start out with the two random books that I read in the month of November that didn't have to do with either of those categories. And the first one is a classic. I've tried to read a classic every month this year and I have so far succeeded. And this month I finally crossed this one off my TBR. It's been on it for too long. And that was Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. So Jane Eyre, how'd it go for me? It wasn't a favorite. I ended up landing on 3 stars. This was quite a journey though. There were parts of the book that I really enjoyed. There were parts that bored me to tears and I didn't really love. And I kind of had problems with a lot of the characters and a lot of the plot. It was beautifully written. It did feel a little excessive at times and just like over the top as well. It was an interesting story and I'm glad I read it to like understand, you know, the classic canon. At the end of the day, the romance in it just really bothered me, just to my core. It made me feel all kinds of ickiness inside, and so I had a hard time rooting and caring about the main couple and the main character, but at times it was also pleasant to read and there were definitely parts of it that I enjoyed. So 3 stars it is. I'm glad I read it. Maybe I'll revisit it someday in the future, but you know, wasn't like a, oh man, this is the best classic ever. The next book that was neither a nonfiction or a historical fiction, but in fact was a thriller that was also on my TBR for a long time, and I'm glad I finally got to it. It was actually a book that I purchased in the UK in anticipation to read it, and I buddy read it with the lovely Nikki from Red Dot Reads, and that is 3 Hours by Rosamund Lupton. This was a fantastic book, a very thrilling, exciting read, and I'm glad it lived up to the hype. It's definitely one of my favorite reads of the month. This book is about a school shooting in the town of Somerset in the UK, and the whole book covers 3 hours of time. And even though this book was fast-paced and suspenseful and kept me on my toes, it was not only the plot that drove it. There was beautiful character development in the story, which was absolutely shocking to me how well the characters were developed, because this is a short read, it's a fast read, but the author was so smart, and the way that she crafted this whole story together and the way that she told the different perspectives. You get teachers, you get multiple students, you get parents, you get the police involved. There was just so many moving parts to the story, and maybe it felt a little bit overwhelming at first, but it worked so well. This is about a 4.5 stars for me. A wonderful book, and I would highly recommend. It isn't published in the US yet, so you can't really get it anywhere, I think, except for Amazon. And I also will say, for my American friends, I would highly recommend reading this alongside with someone from the UK. I had the pleasure of reading this with Nikki, who is from the UK and she currently lives in Singapore, but she had so much wonderful perspective that enlightened me and helped me with some parts that I couldn't, you know, fully relate to. But she is a teacher and she understands like the UK school system, so she was able to like help me along the way understand and explain some parts, and I absolutely love that. So if you are enticed to read this book, I would recommend doing that. You don't have to do that, you're not gonna like miss out, but it was just a wonderful addition to this reading experience. This book is now added to my very small list of thrillers that I absolutely love and would highly recommend to people. Next up, let me touch on historical fiction. The books that I read for Historathon, which again was a historical fiction readathon, and we had a bunch of prompts that really I chose my TBR from. I did not read them in order of the prompts, and I also wasn't able to complete all my 9 reads. I have 5 historical fiction books that I finished in the month of November. Our group read book was The Lost Earls of Willowbrook by Ellen Marie Wiseman. This is the large print edition that I was able to get from my library, and we talked about this book at length in a live on Amanda from the Curly Readers channel. I'll link that down below if you're at all interested. And I was definitely in the minority, but not alone in not liking this book at all. The one pro and kind of positive takeaway from this reading experience was that I learned about a part of history I was not aware of, and this book was based on a true school, or really like detention center for disabled people in New York and Staten Island, and there were horrible conditions for the people that were housed there, just treated terribly. That part was interesting to learn about, but where the story went and the main character involved, I really did not get along with. I did not enjoy at all. She's 16 years old, and even though this book is not YA, it felt YA, and I found her to be quite annoying in her thought process. This book was very repetitive, not think it was well written. There was way too many convenient things that happened. It all wrapped up in a nice bow. The person that we find out is evil was really obvious, and there was just a lot of it that I was like, ugh. rolling my eyes. So definitely not a historical fiction that I got along with. And now I'm kind of skeptical to try more Ellen Marie Wiseman, but I got a list of good ones to try from that live discussion that we had. So I might give her a try one more time. I maybe can understand why people got along with it too and, you know, enjoyed their time with it, but it just didn't work for me. Next up, I'll mention another historical fiction that I'm also so sad I did not get along with because I was so highly anticipating it being a fantastic read, and that was Joan by Catherine J. Chen. Not a bad book at all. Wasn't a horrible experience. It was also very interesting to learn about a perspective that I have not read before. This was set in the 1400s in France, and it quite heavily dove into like the politics of that time in France and how France and England were at war and the different kings involved and all the fighting that was happening. It was very much seeped in that history, which was kind of interesting and also a little bit boring for me. So that's why I didn't totally love this one. The main character is Joan of Arc, and she was a very powerful woman and one that was highly abused and mistreated as a young child, and she had the physical characteristics of a large man, and she was able to physically do things that a lot of women didn't do during her time. And so she was able to fight for the side of France, and the king sent her off to fight many battles, and then that was kind of it. There was a lot of like lyrical flowery language in here. I maybe imagine that those that really loved Hamnet could get along with this read because it kind of reminisced that reading experience for me. This totally has a readership and a group of people that would probably love it. I just found it a little bit boring, so I ended up giving this one 2 stars. It was a meh kind of book for me, unfortunately. A historical fiction I'm happy to say did work for me, I gave it 4 stars, is The Exiles by Christina Baker Klein. I read her most notable book, Orphan Train, by her last year for Historathon and loved it. This one didn't love quite as much, but it was still really well done. This was a perspective that was so unique and I thought was beautifully told about women who were prisoners in England, sent off on ships to Australia. This follows several different characters and different women that were on this ship and also covered really horrible conditions. Prisoners just had no rights and no way to stand up for themselves. It was mostly a very sad and tragic story, but it wrapped up in a hopeful way, not overly convenient with the bow at the end, but still left like a happy kind of ending. There were parts that were lacking depth for me, and I wish some things were explored a little bit more, so it wasn't perfect by any means, but a really solid read. And then I finished off Historathon with 2 middle grades. The first one is Esperanza Rising by Pam Munoz-Ryan. This is a well-beloved book, and I'm happy that I picked it up. I gave this one 4 stars. This follows a young girl named Esperanza who has to flee from Mexico with her family to the California area, joins the immigrant population that were working in the agriculture industry in California and fighting for workers' rights during the Great Depression. It's just a beautiful story. It touches on different aspects of Hispanic culture and found family and fleeing and leaving your home and loved ones, and there were lots of beautiful and heavy themes explored, but I really appreciated this middle grade read. And finally, for historical fiction, I revisited a favorite. I talked about this book in my top 10 historical fiction books and about wanting to reread it because it was most likely my first exposure to historical fiction ever in 4th grade, and I haven't read it since, so I'm glad I picked it up. That is Number the Stars by Lewis Lowry. This is a very well-beloved book, and I think it stands the test of time. It didn't quite reach 5 stars for me. It was 4 stars because it's too short. I wish it was longer, and I understand that this is for a young audience. This is like for 9 and 10-year-olds. I get it. It needs to be short, but I think it could have been longer because, you know, this one, Esperanza Rising, is a little bit longer and there was more to the story, and I wish there was just a little bit more here. It's a very short read, but I thought it was very well done, and the message that it wants to tell about being brave even as a 10-year-old girl, and the historical context of helping Jews in Denmark and this family that was involved in the resistance was beautifully told, and so it was really fun to revisit this one. All right, and then last but not least, nonfiction for Nonfiction November. There were 4 prompts or 4 words. Most of these books fit into at least one of those prompts. I'm not going to go into that, but I was able to read 8 nonfiction reads this month and definitely had a variety of ones that I loved and didn't love very much. The first 3 that I'll start with are all celebrity memoirs that came out this year. My first read of the month being Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing by Matthew Perry. This was a highly anticipated read for me. I'm a huge fan of the show Friends, and Matthew Perry is the first cast member of the main 6 to write a memoir about his life. And so I was very eager to pick this up. It is a short read. I've listened to the audiobook, which was great because it was narrated by him, and a lot of his humor and like the way he enunciates different things really came through. So I would highly recommend that if you want to pick the book up. But the majority of this book doesn't even cover Friends. It actually touches on Friends very little. More so than anything, this book covers the big terrible thing, which is his addiction to drugs and alcohol and the battle that he's had with this disease. He starts off the book with a bang of him being hospitalized and almost dying, I think recently in like the last year or so, and how he really had to turn his life around. He got basically a second chance of living. He's also pretty blunt and open about his relationships with a bunch of different women in the Hollywood industry and also random other women in his life, and just kind of talks about all of his exploits there. All that to say, I really appreciated how vulnerable he got. This was a very enlightening read about what it is like to live with addiction on this scale and how it completely takes over your life. And so it helped me with like my empathy to maybe understand someone in that situation a little bit better. This next read is actually by someone that Matthew Perry mentioned in his book. I believe he dated her, and that is Lauren Graham. Have I told you this already? Stories I didn't want to forget to remember. I read Talking as Fast as I Can because I'm a fan of the show Gilmore Girls, and that book really covers the behind the scenes of that show. This book, not so much. This book was more of a collection of essays and random thoughts and meanderings that Lauren Graham has had since writing that previous book, and I gave this one 3 stars. It was light, it was fun, it was humorous, it was a bit silly, and it's a good time, but it definitely was not like memorable or impacted me in really any kind of capacity. And then the third celebrity memoir, I had absolutely no intention of reading, but the hype got to me. I had to read this book, just had to, because I need to know what all the fuss is about. Everyone and their mom loves it, and that is I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. This book is gonna win all of the popularity contests for this year. It's probably the most like popular book of the year. It's a bit crazy, so I just had to see what all the fuss is about. And it was also a very interesting read. I was not a fan of the show iCarly on Nickelodeon, so I had like zero knowledge of her or her acting career. But similarly to how Matthew Perry's main book focuses on drug addiction, in Jeanette McCurdy's book, it's much more than just a celebrity memoir of her Hollywood life. It really touches on her abusive relationship with her mother and also her battle with eating disorders from anorexia to bulimia. And it was quite hard to listen to. I also listened to the audiobook that she narrated. Again, very vulnerable, which I appreciated. Just a first-hand account of what your mind is going through when you are dealing with an eating disorder and with kind of a crazy family and background. So I can totally understand what the hype is about and why people really love this book, because it was well done and quite revealing. Without even meaning to, I picked up another nonfiction that has to do with an eating disorder, and that is Lighter Than My Shadow by Katie Green. This is a graphic novel memoir about Katie Green's experience with anorexia and depression and sexual abuse, and just a lot of like the inner trauma that she had to deal with. The illustration style is very simplistic and like monochromatic, but I also thought this one was really well done. It really goes into the inner thought life of what Katie Green was dealing with all throughout her middle school, high school, kind of college years. I think the only thing I'll say is that this graphic novel struggled a bit with its pacing. I really had a hard time telling what age she is based on the illustration style, and there's also like flashbacks and dreams and paranoia kind of depicted, and it was also quite repetitive. I think that's just the theme that I've realized from reading some of these books about addiction or eating disorders or these other kind of diseases. It's quite repetitive. You go through a dark spell, you get through it, you think you get better, and then it happens again, and then it happens again, and then it happens again. It's very like cyclical and repetitive, and a disease for a good reason. It's not just like a snap out of it and get over it kind of thing. So again, enlightening to kind of realize from reading these kinds of books, but would recommend again if you're interested in that subject matter. Next, I'll touch on the 2 books that I read that has to do with like the medical industry. The first one is This Is Going to Hurt: Secret Diaries of a Medical Resident by Adam Kay. I gravitated towards this read because 1, it's short, and 2, I'm currently making my way through Grey's Anatomy. Don't ask me why. There are 19 seasons and it's gonna take me a really long time. In this book, Adam Kay is a medical resident, as we call it in the US, but he actually was a doctor in the UK for NHS, and this is truly his diary entries. And he just chronicles different moments and stories from being a doctor. And this one really took me by surprise. Number 1, I did not think that it was a humor read. I thought this was just like serious stories from working in the hospital. No, that is not what this book is. It was quite funny, but this was very dark, crude, almost like politically incorrect humor. You know, you're reading it and you're like, oh, I really shouldn't be laughing. That's like a bad joke, you know? And that was mostly what this was. The stories really like poked fun at people, made fun, and just like made the joke kind of intense. And so I would not recommend this book to everyone. This is not everyone's sense of humor. A lot of people would probably be offended and really annoyed and kind of taken aback by Adam K's humor. But if that doesn't turn you off or scare you, you'd probably have a good time reading it. It really goes into like the problems with the medical industry and just how hard it is to be a doctor, and you're kind of set up for failure. And there really are a lot of wild things that happen in hospitals. Speaking of very wild and inappropriate and horrible things happening at hospitals, another one I read in November is 5 Days at Memorial by Sherry Fink. Life and Death in a Storm-Ravaged Hospital. This book covers the events that happened at Memorial Hospital, which was a hospital in Louisiana, and it got hit by Hurricane Katrina and basically completely shut down. People were evacuated, some people were still stuck inside, and even in the process of evacuation and communicating with other people, a few doctors and nurses decided to euthanize a bunch of patients for really absolutely no reason. And so this book chronicles the events of what happened in the hospital, and then also the aftermath and the trial of those doctors and nurses. It was wild to learn and read about. It definitely was like, what the heck were these doctors doing? Completely taking it out of hand. I think like mistreating people was my kind of takeaway from this book. I don't know if the author intended to lead the reader there. I felt like that was the bias going in, was that the doctors did do harm and kill people, but in the trial they got away with it and they were found not guilty. Overall, this was an interesting read and I feel like I learned a lot. I was not aware of the situation when it happened, but it was a bit long and a bit tedious at times and kind of like too much information. I definitely feel like this book could have used a little bit of like editing and more focus at parts. But again, learned something new. It was a bit wild. And then my last two reads are more of like nature nonfiction. The first one that I'm going to talk about is H is for Hawk by Helen MacDonald. I really did not like this book. I gave it like a pity 2 stars. It was more like a 1 star for me. I really didn't like it. It was really fun buddy reading this with Kristen from Enter the Book, and she definitely liked this book more than I did. I thought this book was one thing and I was completely thrown off by what it actually was. Yes, the author, Helen MacDonald, loses her dad and deals with the grief of losing her father, and she decides to get a hawk and raise a hawk and learns all about falconry and how to have this pet hawk, which parts of it were kind of interesting. But every other chapter, and I would say the majority of this book, was like a random essay about this guy. I think his name is E.B. White or T.B. White, and he wrote some book about hawks maybe 50, maybe 100 or a couple hundred years ago. I'm not even sure. I basically erased those chapters from my mind because I was so bored. And somehow I think the author is trying to like relate her story to this other guy's story, but it did not connect to me and it did not work to me, and I could care less about that guy and his weird life and how he raised hawks. I wanted to learn more about her and her story and different stories about her father and how losing her father was hard and why, because of her relationship with her dad. None of that was explored. The only thing that she kind of talked about a little bit was like her eulogy that she wrote for her dad, and that was beautiful to kind of see a glimpse into her relationship with her father. But that was like 1 chapter. The rest of this book kind of was nonsense to me. So yeah, I didn't really get along with it or understand the hype for this one, unfortunately. And finally, I will end with a book that was a pleasant surprise, one that I didn't intend to read in the month of November, but I decided to pick it up last minute, one of the first books I read, because my local library where I actually work, there is a book group, and this was the book chosen for the month of November, and that is The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wohlleben. This is a translated nonfiction from German, and the author goes deep into the world of trees. This book is well titled, as it is exactly what it says it is. This goes into detail about how trees live, communicate, how they feel, and all of the hidden things that go on behind the scenes that we are not aware of. I will say this book has made me completely look at trees in a new way. It is wild, it is wonderful, it's made me appreciate trees much more, and has made me want to pause more in nature and just kind of reflect and take it all in. So this was a lovely read, and I would highly recommend if you're interested in that nature world. If you're a fan of like nature documentaries, I feel like this is the kind of read for you. And also, it was really enhanced by the illustrated edition. This illustrated edition is abridged, but you kind of get all of the gist of the information from the original text. It also makes a beautiful coffee table book, so if you're looking for a last minute gift and you have someone in mind that you think that would love it, it's full of gorgeous photography. Look at this lovely snowy landscape. So yeah, this one was a lovely, pleasant surprise in the month of November. So that wraps up my reading for the month of November. A lot of fun reads, a lot of good ones, some meh ones that weren't favorites. We have very few days left of this year, and I'm hoping to finish the year off strong with some good reads. Please let me know down below if you had a 5-star nonfiction or historical fiction for the month of November. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in another video soon. Bye!